So we've got our acetanilide in the desiccator, and it's been sitting there for a couple of days. So it should be nice and dry. That was 50 milliliter beaker with DCl-10-49A in it. So hopefully it's a nice powdery solid now. First thing I need to do is take the piece of filter paper out, which I'll get with tweezers. And then we're going to heat this 50% ethanol, which we made the other day. And I'm going to stick a stir bar in there so we don't get any localized hot spots. And we're going to want to get that up close to boiling. I'm going to turn on this stirring hot plate, set that spinner at about halfway between the 300 and the 450, and I'm going to crank this up to halfway between 100 and 150. That should get me to the boiling point. We'll just let that start to heat. You can ignore that. That's the unknown alcohol lab. I'm doing these two labs simultaneously. That's just cranking away in the background, refluxing for an hour. So you can see that the solid is a lot better behaved now. It's still a little sticky, but nowhere near as sticky as it was. And we should be able to grab that piece of filter paper out. Discard that. Definitely still a little sticky, might still be a little wet. That desiccant was maybe not 100% clean. But since we're going to be recrystallizing it from a 50-50 aqueous ethanol mixture anyway, it being a little wet's not a huge problem. All that will do is mess with our yield a little bit. So we do want to keep a little bit aside because we're going to want to get a crude mass spec. I'm going to go weigh this. So the mass of the beaker now with the solid in it is 31.164 grams. 31.164 grams. I'm going to add a boiling stone to that so that when I start adding the solvent for the recrystallization, that doesn't bump. A nice large boiling stone. Looks like a good one. Maybe I'll stick 2 in there just to be safe. I have labeled some vials. So I have 49A here, and I have 49B, which will be the recrystallized material. I also have 48A, and I have a 49C in case we want to take a mass spec on the filtrate. So 49A, which is this solid here, need a small amount for a mass spec sample. So I'm just going to take a little bit of that solid using the other end, the thin end of the spatula. Doesn't take much for mass spec. So I'm just going to take a little bit of that solid. That's way too much. That is sticky. Shit. Try to smear it in the vial. That should be plenty of solid for a mass spec. Solid is definitely not dry. But it doesn't need to be for a mass spec because the water won't interfere. So we'll just save that for later for making up the mass spec sample. I wouldn't be shocked if the yield's a little high here, since clearly that solid is not dry, even after 2 full days sitting in the desiccator. So we're waiting for that to boil. I'm going to grab a pipette that I'm going to use to transfer the ethanol. Pipette bulb that doesn't stick. And I'll also grab a filtration assembly. So we're going to need a 50 milliliter flask and our Hirsch funnel and the adapter as usual, and filter paper. Clamp that in the assembly that we've been using. And attach it with the vacuum hose. Kind of pull on that. Adjust the piece of paper so it covers all the holes. And I'll wet that with some cold solvent before I actually use it. But it can just sit there till we're ready. So I don't know how much solvent is going to be required, but I'll start by adding a couple of pipettes full. Just try to wash some of that solid down from the walls of the beaker. So 3 pipettes, maybe about 3 milliliters of solvent total so far. And we'll stick that on the hot plate as well to get that to boil. Normally I would transfer this to a smaller flask, but since it's so sticky and it doesn't really want to come off that beaker, we're just going to dissolve it in the solvent in that beaker. And then I'll pour it into a small Erlenmeyer flask to actually crystallize, but I don't know what size yet because I'm not sure how much solvent it's going to require. And it may not require any more than I've already added. Also want to try to wash the remaining solid off the spatula. Both ends of the spatula are dirty with solid. forceps as well. So it actually looks like it's probably going to go into just that very small amount of solvent. Once that gets boiling. Use our spatula to try to push the remaining solid that's stuck on the walls down in. I just want to get that to boil before I transfer it. Maybe let a little bit evaporate. So it looks like what we're going to want to crystallize that in is a small test tube. So we minimize the surface area. One of these 3-inch test tubes should do the job. And I probably don't need any more. I don't need to heat the rest of that. It looks like we got complete solution with just that small amount. Ethanol boils at 78, water obviously at 100, so this mixture is going to boil somewhere in between that. Crank this up to 150. Once it boils, you should see some bubbles around the boiling stone. It'll boil eventually. Well, while we're waiting for that to boil, I'm going to use some of this solvent to measure the volume of this test tube. So that full test tube has a volume of about 4 milliliters, which means that it should fit the contents of that's just ethanol. So I'm going to want some cold solvent to wash the crystals with. So I'm going to pour about 10 milliliters into this little Erlenmeyer flask and go grab an ice bath to sink that in. That way that'll be ready when we need it.